Over Europe and beyond, there existed a deadly period during the medieval ages when hunger lasted not days or months but years. When this killing hunger began in the year 1315, food became scarcer with each passing day for millions of inhabitants. Adding to this misery was the fact it took up to 7 years for many parts of the continent to resume a regular food supply. Survival on a daily basis was tough during the medieval ages, though the Great Famine made life too unbearable for many, taking millions of lives from across northern Europe. Of all the crises which fell upon this continent during the 14th century, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is one of the least remembered in modern times. Nevertheless, for the inhabitants of northern Europe, this Great Famine felt like civilization itself would never be the same again. The Great Hunger begins. During 1315 AD, Benedictine monk John of Trocolo witnessed the ravages of this deadly Great Famine gripping northern Europe. He was compelled to chronicle this horrific event so others would read about the misery which existed in England at the time. The following is just a portion of his account. Meat and eggs began to run out. Capons and fowl could hardly be found. Animals died of pests. Swine could not be fed because of the excessive price of fodder. A quarter of wheat or beans or peas sold for 20 shillings, barley for a mark, oats for 10 shillings. A quarter of salt was commonly sold for 35 shillings, which in former times was quite unheard of. The land was so oppressed with want that when the king came to St. Albans on the feast of St. Lawrence, August the 10th, it was hardly possible to find bread on sale to supply his immediate household. Bread did not have its usual nourishing power and strength because the grain was not nourished by the warmth of summer sunshine. Hence those who ate it, even in large quantities, were hungry again after a little while. There can be no doubt that the poor wasted away when even the rich were constantly hungry. The Great Famine of 1315 conquers Europe. How did this catastrophic food scarcity happen? During the month of April 1315, the Little Ice Age brought unusually cool, wet weather for the growing season, followed later in the year by a harsh, bitter winter. As any farmer can tell you, persistent, soggy weather during the growing season can lead to crop failures come harvest time. The weeks of constant downpour will rot grain and carry seeds away from the soil. These seeds could not properly ripen under such miserable conditions. As a result, crop yields were cut in 1315 by up to 1/2 compared to previous levels reported from the 13th century. Prices for wheat, oats, barley, and bread soared due to severe supply shortages. As for the hay feed livestock depended upon, they too suffered from a lack of fodder. As food prices began to rise, even less preserved meat was available, due to decreased brine from a lack of suitable evaporation. That is, when there was livestock available that had not already perished due to diseases like cattle plague or harsh weather conditions. Many would go hungry, scavenging for edible wild roots, grasses, and even tree bark to survive widespread hunger. Unfortunately, there was no relief from severe weather when the spring of 1316 arrived, as heavy rain and severe cold persisted. Peasants, who represented 95% of the population, did not enjoy the convenience of emergency supplies. Under the feudal system, nobility controlled vast amounts of agricultural farmland. With noble families having a tough time feeding themselves, their obligation of care for serfs ceased. When natural disaster struck with the Little Ice Age, the nobility, which controlled a majority of food production, lost their way in managing large estates. Unfortunately, there were no sufficient food source alternatives to compensate for their mismanagement during the Great Famine. Experiencing a dramatic decrease in revenue from their land holdings, these higher classes in the feudal system needed to raise funds for their own survival. Land sale, obtaining loans, and selling valuable possessions were just a few ways they attempted to gain money for purchasing food. As for peasants, they did not have such opportunities. Therefore, they slaughtered work animals and even ate cats and dogs. Peasants also ate the seeds normally used to sow crops. In the most miserable cases of hardship, parents left children to fend on their own for survival. Poaching, livestock rustlings, and breaking into unguarded homes for food were some of the more common violations. Though with tens of thousands starving, theft, burglary, and even murder also became a desperate means for food survival. In some countries, cannibalism was documented to have occurred. Within the northern part of the continent, under some horrific instances, family members turned on each other to survive. These actions are unfathomable today or at any other time. Though under this great famine, the depths of starvation and despair people endured was beyond comprehension. Indeed, this was the worst recorded famine if measured by the death toll percentage of total population in European history. When the Great Famine ended, the continent was a violent place, with warfare increasing and the end of noble conduct. The Great Famine, which according to some estimates claimed up to 6 million people, displayed the lowest depths to which societies could fall in order to survive. As generations moved forward, the need to protect common people from a devastating lack of food became of greater concern for governments and communities alike. In the medieval ages, a loose network of poor relief, mainly monasteries, religious institutions, and layman organizations attempted to do this work. They employed methods like poor boxes and communal agriculture. However, this was largely ineffective for dealing with hunger issues, as the Great Famine demonstrated to everyone. During medieval times in Europe, famines were a deadly part of everyday life. With some, like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 AD, untold millions lost their lives throughout Europe, though many more inhabitants of the continent were lost through other devastating famines. One harsh yet little-known famine during the medieval period occurred in the famed city of Constantinople. However, in this instance, it was a famine that was made even more severe by the orders of one person. In this episode, we will present this tragic story which deserves awareness in modern times. Constantinople under fire. The ancient city of Constantinople was under severe stress from various social, strategic, and economic issues at the beginning of the 14th century. Its ruler, the Byzantine Emperor Andronicus II, 1282 to 1328, faced many challenges with the precarious state of his empire. Though it was the significant threat from Turkish forces in vulnerable Anatolia which was his greatest concern in 1302 AD. Therefore, in order to defend his interests in that region, Emperor Andronicus II employed mercenaries from the Great Catalan Company to bolster his defenses in Anatolia. These hired soldiers arrived at Constantinople in January 1303 AD. Initially, these mercenaries rewarded the Byzantine ruler's decision with an important victory against a Turkish attack at the Battle of the Cyzicus in October 1303 AD. Later, after establishing the Catalan Company base at modern-day Urdik in the winter of that year, their leader Roger de Flor returned to Constantinople to secure payment for their services and negotiate their future strategy of liberating the occupied town of Philadelphia. Though as time progressed, the loyalty of these Catalan mercenaries grew increasingly unreliable. They would prove ruthless and quarrelsome, being more trouble than the enemies they were supposed to engage. When the Catalan Company leader returned from Constantinople, he was in shock at what he witnessed. This hired army had become very undisciplined, turning against the population they were employed to protect. These Catalan Company soldiers had become extremely angered, having spent much more than their wages before their leader's return. To compensate, these mercenaries began plundering local villages for personal gain. Seeds to a horrific famine in Constantinople. Unfortunately, as the Great Catalan Company enjoyed a succession of major battle victories, including the Battle of Kibistra in August of 1304, they continued to plunder local villages. As a result, numerous people fled these towns to Constantinople as refugees from the Catalan rampages. Combined with those fleeing from areas which were defeated by the Turks, Constantinople could not meet the increasing demands for housing and food. In addition, the ancient city was already strained by a lack of resources to support its existing population. Therefore, these refugees, starved, hungry, and ignored by the local population, were left with little to no resources for survival. In numerous cases, reports from the period stated these refugees resided in rubbish heaps, so dire was their situation. This misery tipped the city towards a terrifying famine which began in 1304 AD. What made the food situation even more tragic was that there was not necessarily a lack of grains and cereals to feed the city's population. At the time, Venetian merchants dominated the Byzantine grain trade. Their seeking of excess profits led to grain supplies going out of the city's warehouses to markets such as Italy and other Western locations where they fetched a much higher price. There was food to be had in Constantinople, but highly inflated prices meant most of the population could not afford to buy it. In reality, the lower classes were priced out of the market for food necessities in Constantinople, with peasants and the working classes experiencing famine from at least 1304 AD as a result of unfair practices in grain distribution. In past years, the Byzantine Empire ensured fair and good prices for grains and foodstuffs, though economic and other crises in the empire, which now operated with severely limited resources, meant there was little current control over the economy. Thus, in a city traditionally dependent upon occupied Thrace and other distant locales for agricultural products, the state possessed few resources to stop a developing famine in Constantinople. In fact, the emperor was having difficulty raising funds just to meet the aggressive wage demands of the Catalan mercenaries. Despite desperate actions like debasing the currency and new taxes on certain types of grain production, Emperor Andronicus II could not satisfy their monetary demands. During April 1305 AD, lengthy negotiations with the Catalan Grand Company General Roger de Flor ended when he and a large group of his soldiers were assassinated by Alan mercenaries. These orders were given by the emperor's son and were carried out at a banquet in Adrianople. Eventually, word of this massacre reached the main Catalan forces stationed at Gallipoli. They terminated their agreement with the Byzantines at once before exacting revenge on local Byzantine populations. Their murderous rampage and plunder were so horrific that the monks of Mount Athos forbade any Catalan citizens entrance to their premises until the year 2000. Thrace, Macedonia, and Thessaly fell to the rampage, which continued on a path towards southern Greece. There, they vanquished the Duchy of Athens and Thebes. Then, they attempted to lay siege to Constantinople. At this time, Constantinople had no fleet to protect its boundaries. Therefore, Andronicus II had no adequate means to provide supplies or protection to the city. Even the Genoese fleet, which the emperor had relied on in the past, had made peace with the Catalans in exchange for safe passage on their trade routes. The increasingly desperate Byzantine ruler could not even pay the new Catalan leader to stop their siege, as his demands were much too high. Emperor Andronicus II realized that Catalan control of Thrace effectively cut Constantinople off from its largest source of grains. In addition, he lacked the soldiers needed to fight these Catalan mercenaries that controlled most of Thrace. This meant the fields outside of Thrace city walls became the only place to grow vital grains in the area. Since July of 1305, peasants had cultivated these fields under protection of armed soldiers. Suddenly, heeding the severe directions of his advisors, Emperor Andronicus II did the unthinkable. He ordered these peasants to stop cultivating these fields while destroying their crops during the fall of 1306 AD. Citizens were also forbidden to leave the city walls of Thrace. What was the emperor's reason for these harmful decrees? He did not want these valuable food resources to fall into the invaders' hands. Thus, he wanted to starve the Catalan soldiers into leaving Thrace by cutting off the grain supply essential to feeding their soldiers. By doing so, Emperor Andronicus II hoped the Catalans would abandon the region, allowing Thrace in time to once again supply grains to a starving, desperate Constantinople. Inside Constantinople, this was a deeply unpopular policy move. Its population was increasing due to those dispossessed by the Catalans and Turks fleeing to this ancient city. Now, already suffering from a shortage of affordable grains for the working classes, the existing famine became unbearable during the winter season of 1306 to 1307 AD. At this time, the famine proved so severe that whole families were recorded as perishing, with piles of bodies lying upon city streets. Even those that were still alive had barely any strength for burying the dead. The upper classes within Constantinople ignored for the most part assisting working class people in the face of this horrific famine. Even when urged by some prominent citizens like Patriarch Athanasios I to give charity and food to suffering fellow citizens, they claimed hardship themselves. These declarations by the wealthy were dishonest actions in many instances, while in truth they hoarded valuable grains and cereals. The Patriarch pleaded for the emperor to alleviate the famine for many of its citizens by purchasing bread and grains for distribution to the needy, though his pleas were not met in any measurable way. As a result, Athanasios I established soup kitchens serving boiled gruel and the donated wheat, wine, fish, vegetables, shoes, and clothing which came from charitable citizens. His bold and commendable actions during the height of this horrific famine in the winter of 1306 to 1307 did help to ease some misery, though the emperor remained unwilling to assist the working class's starvation. Finally, in the summer of 1307 AD, the cruel strategy that caused death and famine throughout Constantinople led to a bitter success. Emperor Andronicus II's harsh plan was vindicated when the Catalans at last left Thrace because their soldiers were suffering from a severe lack of food. Soon there was more good news for the distressed city. Importation of grains into Constantinople from the Black Sea was resumed following the Catalan departure from Thrace. Eventually, this latest famine was resolved, though at a great cost in terms of death and utter misery. Emperor Andronicus II used the famine of his own citizens to starve these Catalan invaders from a vital food source, thus saving a key part of the Byzantine Empire from being conquered. During medieval times, messages were left to warn future generations of humanity that a famine catastrophe could happen again. These messages of doom were not written in manuscripts, books, or official records. Known as a hunger stone, or in German language as Hungerstein, they would be a solid, ageless reminder to humanity that severe hunger would happen whenever the water level of rivers fell too low. Waterways, a sustaining life force for many communities in medieval times, would bear grave consequences whenever the hunger stone made its sudden appearance. Today, carved messages on these large boulders are beginning to show their ominous presence in Central European riverbeds with increasing frequency. Recent extreme droughts in 2018 and 2022 have hastened many sightings of their medieval warnings for future generations to heed. These carved boulders foretold that whenever they appeared, people in these regions should prepare for devastating historic droughts. Then, hardship with food supply and severe hunger would surely follow. Hello everyone, my name is Craig, host of Medieval to Modern. We feature fascinating information from civilization's medieval ages. Thank you for joining us today, and please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to help grow this channel. On the Elbe River, which flows of course from its source in the Czech Republic mountains to the North Sea, hunger stones marking dramatically lower water levels have been sighted at a number of locations. However, it is not the only river on the continent to see these startling messages from the past. Various other hunger stones have been located, including one with an inscription dating to the year 1417 AD in Germany on the Spree River. Hunger stones, a name given to these inscribed boulders in the 20th century, served a practical purpose in medieval times. They marked river levels for the years when transportation and trade could no longer function properly. These years would be carved into stone as a warning to future generations. If the water levels ever came this low, trouble would soon follow. In a time without modern conveniences, there were severe consequences from drought. Along with decreased food supplies, there would be higher prices for necessary supplies and reduced commerce. The city of Deccan, which is situated along the Elbe River in the Czech Republic, has been the location for a number of these hydrological landmarks. One of the more ominous warnings, carved in 1616 AD on a hunger stone in the Elbe River, can be found at this place. Its carved message, "Wenn du mich siehst, dann weine," when translated into English from German, reads, "When you see me, weep." Researchers believe there are even older hunger stones still waiting to be found. In Pirna, Germany, after examining town archives, information was discovered which indicates the presence of a hunger stone dating to 1115 AD. Unfortunately, it has not been located. With prolonged droughts becoming more noticeable in Europe, hunger stones are not the only large items resurfacing from watery resting places. In 2022, the submerged old Packhorse Bridge from the English village of Batings in Yorkshire miraculously came into view at the Batings Dam Reservoir. In Spain, a submerged village has resurfaced with the drying of a reservoir. The Galician village of Portomarín, whose old town has been underwater from the Belisar Reservoir since the 1960s, has reappeared. This is due to the reservoir currently holding water at 39% capacity because of severe drought. Various researchers say the drought of 2022 is even worse than the dramatic 2018 event in terms of areas affected and persistence. Consistent with dire warnings from hunger stones appearing across Europe, various researchers say the drought of 2022 on the continent could be the worst in over 500 years. Furthermore, with low rivers and warming temperatures in the future, even famous rivers like the Thames could be at risk of levels dropping to the riverbed. Today, although communities are not as reliant on rivers as in medieval times due to alternative transport methods like road and rail, there is one important area where modern societies world over are still vulnerable. Water for crops, drinking, sanitation, and many industrial uses is essential, and a severe decrease in water supply is still very important. When compared to the 15th century, the severity and frequency of severe droughts in recent years is a major cause for concern. Therefore, with the increasing appearance of hunger stones in recent years, the medieval community's reminders continue to be wise advice. People across the globe should be aware of the hunger stones and what they represent to modern society. Of course, there will be those that think of hunger stones as an odd curiosity that are not important today. With a false sense of security, they think these warnings are nothing more than outdated relics with no consequences for current affairs. They would be incorrect to think this way about hunger stones, for they remind us of the real issues our growing world with greater demands impose on a fragile water supply. In the opinion of medieval to modern, hunger stones focus crucial attention on issues concerning physical water scarcity and water stress. Today, approximately 50% of the current world population experiences some form of water scarcity at one period during the year. People should also realize that 97% of the Earth's water is saline, or dissolved salt water, with only 1% of the total water on Earth available to us for practical uses. In fact, only 0.014% of the Earth's water is fresh and readily accessible from sources such as rivers, lakes, or groundwater. Hunger stones are a reminder from medieval times that droughts continue to affect daily lives in dramatic ways. Today, water security is an ongoing issue of concern, while demand for water has grown exponentially. Since 1500 AD, the world population has grown from an estimated 503.24 million people to 7.76 billion in 2019. With such a dramatic increase in demand for usable water, how can one say hunger stones as a practical indicator of water scarcity are any less relevant than in medieval times? When one considers the huge increase in commercial water usage since the hunger stone carving of 1417 AD, along with sanitation usage for a growing world, the hunger stones are a wise warning indeed. Even though they were used to mark levels of river depth, hunger stones are a timeless representation of how precious water supply continues to be for communities worldwide. Therefore, to view these hydrological landmarks as an odd curiosity from the past which no longer have merit is to ignore important issues which still require solutions. It is an ominous sign that hunger stone sightings have increased in frequency as the centuries move forward. One could reasonably suggest this indicates a warming climate also puts water supplies at greater risk across the globe. Water tables in countries like the United States are falling in recent years due to overconsumption alone. For these reasons and many more, the hunger stones are as relevant as they have been for centuries, for it is water that brings forth life and sustains it. At this time, let us not forget that hunger stones also predict the distinct possibility of famine whenever they appear from the riverbed. It is interesting to note in the history of our planet, every inhabited continent has experienced famine. Also, famines in historical terms are cyclical occurrences. However, with improved farming techniques, industrial crops, better land use, and other adaptations towards the beginning of the 17th century, countries like England were able to disrupt this pattern. The last famine in peacetime on English soil was from 1623 to 1624. Medieval to modern appreciates how once again a contribution from the Middle Ages has importance in the modern era. Today, hunger stones still perform their original practical function, though their meaning goes much deeper. Water is the basis for modern survival, just as it was when these hydrological landmarks were placed in various rivers across Central Europe during the Middle Ages. With drought situations still impacting large areas of the globe, especially regions reliant on subsistence farming, extremely low water levels continue to bring terrible famine. Today, water transport by rivers for commerce plays a less important role, though even here there is a significant cost with decreased water levels. For industrial producers and large commercial enterprises, it is much more economical to ship by water, especially heavy bulk items and goods. It takes much more in terms of energy, labor, and overall efficiency to transport such items by land using trucks or rail. Therefore, hunger stones and their dire warnings of low river water levels can still indicate major hardship for commercial trade. During our modern times, researchers are analyzing emerging climate crises with increasing urgency. People are realizing that if these dramatic climate factors lead to reduced crops and harvests because of decreased water availability, the role of modern transportation becomes much less significant. Therefore, hunger stones and their warnings should remain a constant concern for modern societies in terms of water supplies, management, and growing our food. For without adequate supplies of usable water, Great Famine may visit many areas of the world in the future. Thank you for supporting us at Medieval to Modern. Please be sure to watch our next episode or one shown at the end of this video. Also be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and spread the word about this channel so we can create more exciting content. I wish you good tidings as we remember that sharing knowledge has been a noble deed throughout the ages.